The Catholic Church is still judged for sex scandals from decades ago, but becomes the moral authority once the Pope criticizes Donald Trump. A single accidental bomb strike on a school in Iran shocks the world, while Christian girls in Nigeria are kidnapped again and again by Boko Haram. The Pope has religious counterparts in Islam leading an actual theocracy, but directs his message to elected leaders instead. Words from Trump are called dangerous rhetoric, while threats from Iran are treated as routine. Iran backs Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, but the Pope's warnings are aimed at Benjamin Netanyahu and at Washington. Iran threatens shipping and neutral nations with actual missiles and drones, but Trump's speeches are called dangerous. Popes went 240 years between canonizations. Now they come in clusters. The moral voice of the Pope, elevated by the mainstream press, simply echoes the mainstream press. Let's start with the obvious problem. Quoting the Pope on war is an appeal to authority fallacy. Now, briefly, what does that actually mean? A logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning. It's when an argument sounds persuasive but doesn't actually prove anything. In this case, an appeal to authority fallacy says, the Pope is important, therefore what he says must be true. But that only works when the authority is speaking within his area of expertise. You would trust a surgeon on heart surgery. You'd trust a pilot on flying an airplane. But you wouldn't take a surgeon's opinion as proof about aviation. And that's the issue here. The Pope is a spiritual leader. He's not a military strategist. He's not a diplomat. And he is not the arbiter of Middle Eastern conflict. His lane is theology. His responsibility is shepherding the faithful. The press ought to be pointing out this error. And more specifically, if the Pope is going to speak out about a conflict shaped heavily by religion, then his natural counterparts are not political leaders like Donald Trump or Netanyahu. They are, on the other hand, the clerical rulers of Iran. The men who actually fuse religion with state power. The clerics running the country who openly speak in theological terms about destroying Israel. If there's a voice for the Pope to confront in this conflict, it's not in Washington, it's not in Jerusalem, it's in Tehran. And yet, silence on Iran and criticism for Washington. Now step back and ask a more practical question. What is the Pope's actual job right now? The Catholic Church is shrinking in the West. Attendance is down. Its credibility has taken hits that haven't fully healed. That alone would be a full-time assignment. And yet, rather than focusing inward, we see outward commentary on a war thousands of miles away. And at the same time, there's something far more direct within his lane. Christians under attack. Not hypothetically, not politically, physically. We all saw the reports out of Iran. A girls' school accidentally hit by a bomb in the chaos of war. Children killed in a single tragic event. Horrific, indefensible, the kind of thing that rightly shocks the world. But now zoom out, because in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, this isn't a one-time tragedy, it's a pattern. And it's carried out by Boko Haram, an explicitly Islamist terrorist group seeking to impose religious rule. Start with one many remember, April 14, 2014, Chibok, Nigeria. 276 schoolgirls kidnapped from a Christian community. That wasn't the end, but the beginning of a model. So just look at the recent wave. March 7, 2024, Kaduna State. Over 200 students abducted from a school assembly. Last November, Kebbi State. Armed gunmen raid a girls' boarding school at night. Girls kidnapped, staff killed trying to stop them. Also in November, in Niger State, a Catholic school. 300-plus students and teachers abducted in one of the largest mass kidnappings in years. And that's just a snapshot of a pattern of night raids, dormitories breached, children taken at gunpoint. And the aftermath, one of forced conversion, sexual violence, ransom, or worse. And all the schools were closed in the aftermath of the latest kidnapping. Many remain closed, and girls cannot be educated as a result. And this isn't collateral damage, it's targeting. So when we talk about a school struck in Iran, we're talking about a tragic moment in a war. But when we talk about Nigeria, we're talking about a decade-long campaign of school raids tied to Islamic groups targeting vulnerable populations, including Christians. Which raises the obvious question. If a global religious leader like the Pope is going to speak out about a war and violence, why isn't it here? Why not speak for the Christian children, the innocent lambs of his own flock? Now the Pope is in Africa, right now, visiting Angola. Give him some credit, Angola is a majority Christian nation, and the largest portion is Roman Catholic. And the press is quoting the religious leaders there and the people who say the Iran war is wrong and Trump is the reason. The Angolans want peace in the Middle East and blame Trump for the war. Well, we're not so naive as to think that being a Christian nation makes Angolans the voice of peace. The press has forgotten that Angolans have been killing each other by the millions in a state of continuous conflict ever since independence in 1961. That's not very Christian. Maybe the Pope could speak to that issue. The life expectancy in Angola is 50 years. It's much higher in the wealthy city and lower in the countryside. A fifth of their children never reach adulthood. The rich get richer extracting oil and diamonds and exporting it, and the money never reaches the people. Maybe, just maybe, there are some lessons the Pope could lecture about to the president of that country. But Pope Leo doesn't seem to be concerned about the Christian victims of any government, not even a Christian one. Now, this part is less about the Pope and more about the pattern we all recognize in society and especially in the press, because the Catholic Church has spent decades under heavy criticism for the priest-child sex abuse scandal. And again, that criticism was warranted. Those events were real. But they were largely decades ago, even if new details occasionally still emerge. Now look at what's dominating headlines today, the scandal surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. Same category of crime, same moral outrage, same demand for accountability. So here's the question. If the church is still viewed through the lens of past sex scandals, why is its leader now suddenly treated as a great moral authority? The answer isn't complicated. It's because he's criticizing Donald Trump. And that's the qualifier. That's the filter. Disagree with the press on cultural issues, you're outdated. Hold traditional views, you're out of touch. But criticize Donald Trump, and suddenly you're credible, quoted, amplified, and positioned as the voice of moral clarity. Let's talk about a broader context, because this war didn't appear out of nowhere. Iran has been engaged directly or through proxies in conflicts across the Middle East and Africa for years. Groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, all tied to Iran, have extended Iran's reach far beyond its borders. In Yemen, the Houthis have fueled a war the United Nations has repeatedly described as one of the worst humanitarian crises, marked by famine, mass displacement, piracy, and drone and missile attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. In Syria, Iranian-backed forces have helped sustain a conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. In Iraq, militias aligned with Iran continue to destabilize the region. And in Sudan, where the UN now describes the situation as the world's largest humanitarian crisis, millions are displaced, and famine conditions are spreading amid ongoing conflict. Across these regions are all these Islamist-driven or intra-Muslim conflicts, their impact falling heavily on civilians, including Christians. So if the Pope is truly against war, if his message is about peace, restraint, and moral clarity, then where has that urgency been as the violence has been building? And as a religious leader, why has he not spoken out on the attacks upon his own people? The press is already advocating for innocent Muslim victims of war who would be safe if not for radical Islam. Who better to advocate for Christians under attack than the Pope? But instead it's Trump that's trying to make the world safer for everyone. The global moral spotlight doesn't turn on during the years of violence. It only turns on when someone fights back. The Pope criticizes rhetoric. He warned against what he called the delusion of omnipotence. Fair enough, but rhetoric is not violence. And if we're going to treat words as dangerous, then we should at least apply the standard evenly. Because Iran's rhetoric isn't subtle, it's very direct. Its leaders have issued repeated threats against the people and assets of neutral nations, including warnings about closing key shipping routes and targeting vessels in international waters. Not debate or diplomacy, but threats, followed by actual attacks. Launching drones at merchant ships, ballistic missiles at its neighbors. These are war crimes, and force is the only response to war crimes, and the Catholic teaching on just wars recognizes this. And then it narrows, because those same Iranian voices have also made direct threats against Donald Trump. Not implied, but explicit, with attempted violence to follow. So if we're going to talk about dangerous words, we should probably start there, before we get too concerned about Trump's speeches responding to Iranian violence and their war crimes. At this point, the question isn't whether the Pope is speaking, it's what he's reinforcing. Because this isn't a challenge to power on his part. It's not a disruption of the status quo. It's alignment with it. For decades, institutions like the European Union, NATO, and the United Nations have managed Iran, negotiated, contained, sanctioned, but ultimately tolerated a regime widely recognized as a state sponsor of terrorism. That's the status quo, a long-running acceptance that Iran operates through proxies, threats, and regional destabilization, while the world responds with statements, summits, and restraint. And then someone breaks from that pattern. Agree or disagree with the results, Donald Trump has been one of the few leaders willing to directly confront that system. No man compares to Jesus Christ, but Jesus is the one we should emulate. But the Pope, the vicar of Christ, simply follows the party line, says what all the world is saying. Because challenging entrenched behavior is uncomfortable. It's unpopular. It invites criticism. So Donald Trump gets the criticism, while the Pope's message echoes the prevailing tone. Caution, restraint, de-escalation, and all of that directed primarily at the response to violence, not the decades-long cause. So the question for Pope Leo is why? Why step into global politics this way while leaving so much within your own lane untouched? One possibility is uncomfortable but hard to ignore, and that's recognition. Historically, bestowing sainthood on a pope has been very rare. Not just a little rare, but centuries apart. Let's look at the timeline. Pope Pius V was declared a saint in the year 1712. And then, nothing. Not for a generation, not for a century, not for even more. It wasn't until 1954 that another pope, Pope Pius X, was canonized. A 242-year-long gap. 2.5 centuries. Then, even in the modern era, another pause. From that 1954 canonization of Pope Pius, the Church went another 60 years before it canonized another pope. That happened in 2014 when Pope John XXIII was declared a saint. So for most of history, sainthood among popes looked like this. It was rare, distant, and exceptional. But look what happens next. In that same year, 2014, the Church didn't just canonize one pope, it canonized two. And not a pope from the past, but it was Pope John Paul II, also declared a saint in 2014, on the very same day. And just a few years later, in 2018, Pope Paul VI was canonized as well. And in 2022, Pope John Paul I was beatified, placing him on the path. All the popes the baby boomers know. And that's not a trickle, it's a cluster. And when something goes from being centuries apart to being multiple in a decade, it changes how it's perceived and it changes incentives for the people affected. But sainthood is supposed to reflect standing apart from the moment, doing what's right regardless of popularity. But if your public voice consistently aligns with the prevailing global opinion, if it just echoes what institutions and the media already say, you're not standing apart, you're fitting in, and history should remember those two things very differently. At the beginning of his term, Pope Leo was introduced as something historic, a first, a symbol, a new kind of voice. But history doesn't remember symbols, it remembers results. And in this case, the violence didn't start with Donald Trump. The instability didn't begin with Benjamin Netanyahu. It has been driven for years by Islamic regimes and proxies tied to Iran, groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis spreading conflict across the region and beyond. So if you're going to speak as a moral authority, state terrorism driven by radical Islam is where the focus should be. As the head of the Catholic Church, the role of Pope Leo is to confront evil wherever it might be found, not to accommodate it. He began as the first American pope. But if he continues in this fashion as the forces of evil advance, he may be remembered as the first Muslim pope.